We back on? Okay. Kia ora koutou, reconvene our Infrastructure Committee meeting for today, which moves us on to our next item, which is the minutes. I'm happy to move confirmation of the minutes from our 7th of October committee meeting. Look for a seconder. Councillor Hancock. Open it up for any matters arising or any comments. There being none, I'd invite you to vote. That's passed, 10 votes for and none against. Councillors, it was oversight of mine that I've been asked to table apologies for early departure for 3 members. Councillor Butt, Councillor Finlay and Councillor Harpiter, and I'd like those also added to the minutes. Could I have a seconder? Councillor Harpiter, as Councillor Johnson. We don't need a vote, we're just noting those additional apologies for lateness just with the length of the meeting today. Which means it moves us on to item 8, which there is also an officer's report to come, but in light of 2.7.5, which is a notice of motions may not proceed in the absence of the mover unless moved by another member authorised in writing by the mover to do so. And we have had that confirmed that Councillor Harpiter has asked the Deputy Mayor to present her notice of motion on her behalf. Floor is yours.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Who is the seconder?
Sorry, that was me.
Oh, okay.
I'm happy to second it. So, did you want to make comment on her behalf at this point, or just wait for the officer's presentation?
I'll reserve the right to comment following the officer's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to welcome Robert Van Benton, the Manager for Transport and Infrastructure, to the committee to present, and also it's Chris, isn't it? And Chris Lai is also in support of this item.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I've asked Chris, as the transport designer involved with safety, to join me. So, councillors, I'll take the basic report as read, but just following the public comment this morning, just make 1 or 2 clarifications or additional comments. So we certainly acknowledge that the delivery and design staff met with the principal, Sharko, following or around the time of the Stony Creek project, and there was discussions around early concepts for safety treatments on James's line. We'd stressed that they were initial concepts, so they hadn't gone through detailed assessments and design, and there was, at that time, we weren't fully aware, but the consideration which became important later on was the development of the subdivision and the access road from what is now, the first stage will be council's development, immediately west of the railway crossing. So that was one of the additional infrastructure requirements that needed to be considered. So yes, there was a change in the numbers of treatments, and there may, at the time, I think the staff may have indicated the possibility of considering a zebra crossing, but subsequently that wasn't considered to be the safest solution. So we acknowledge maybe that we could have communicated that change maybe more formally. It seems that we wouldn't make the principal aware of that change. So the second point I'd like to make is that all pedestrian crossing solutions, treatments, require judgment on the part of the user. So there is no such thing as an absolutely safe pedestrian facility. So the selected pedestrian crossing treatment is the best practicable solution and the safest one given the technical factors in place. So, and those are the pedestrian use patterns, i.e. significant, numbers of users during short periods in the preschool and post-school pick-up and drop-off. the particular speed environment, and this road does have heavy truck movements as well as it's a key collector road in the network, but also, you know, the access priority for the side roads. So I've talked about the subdivision development. Well, that road that will access the top terrace of the Whakaronga rezone area is, at the moment, under the structure plan, indicated to connect with Stony Creek. So it will become potentially a through road, so which changes the nature of how it will operate. So given that all pedestrian crossing facilities need some judgment, essentially the position we've taken in the cases of nothing such as painting lines on the road confers safety. And in fact, as I explain in the report, there's a perverse outcome with zebra crossings, because there is a perception that somehow if you step out onto the road, you have an absolute right to expect vehicles to stop. That is not the case. Legally, under law, the pedestrian is required to make a judgment about the safe stopping distance for vehicles approaching the crossing. And so, you know, it's our position that really in this case, as in most pedestrian crossing locations across the city, you know, we need to be clear that there is that judgment required. So what's been happening across the city is actually we've been removing zebra crossings in many cases because of those suboptimal safety outcomes. In some cases, we've replaced those with signalised crossings where there are high levels of traffic of pedestrian movement and activity all during the day. And in other cases, we're looking at the sort of solution that was implemented here, which is a pedestrian crossing point. So, and I suppose the third thing I'd like to say is we've had some quite positive feedback from a number of people who previously were critical of the situation there. There were a number of parents and obviously you know, users, but particularly we've had written feedback from Alistair Mayston. Alistair is the road safety coordinator from Horizons, so he actually lives in the area, has had an opportunity to study you know, the outcomes, and I mean, he's quite clear. He says, I quote, "There's been a definite change in average speeds of vehicles approaching the crossings, particularly heavy vehicles. There's a greater awareness of drivers of children with, you know, the increased prominence they have in terms of the threshold in the middle of the road. More cars are choosing to stop to allow students to cross, and he talks about having reinforced with students that they only do so if there is eye contact. Cars are largely adhering also to the no parking lines, and he says there is a high level of, shall we say, utilisation of the crossing points. So, you know, there are smaller numbers of people choosing to cross outside of the provided crossing points. So, you know, we've also engaged with the school, particularly Chris, and Alistair makes the point about potentially changing some of the line marking around those crossing points to potentially stop a little bit more you know, parked vehicles, improve visibility, possibly make the intersection a little bit more visible, and a little bit more signage. So probably that's all just in terms of clarification, further feedback. So happy for us to take questions at this time.
Thank you. There are questions indicated. The Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Robert. I think you've made your advice quite clear. The comment around this, what's there currently being the best practical solution, and obviously the safest in your, is that taking into account the users? So from the public comment from Yako, he really emphasised the 5, 6, 7-year-olds, you know, crossing the road. And so does that, what's there currently, does that take into account the users when making those comments, or is it more around generally?
Well, I suppose I'd put the question, if the user group is of such an age that they're unable to make a safe judgment about crossing the road, the treatment that we provide will not resolve that issue. So if someone is too young, that they need supervision or they need assistance. But once we believe that someone can make that decision, you know, we believe the solution that we've provided is the best and safest solution for this environment. Remember, there are other safer solutions. We could put a signalised intersection, significantly more expensive. There is also the possibility of, it's largely about speed, okay? So if we slow vehicles, then any crossing point becomes safer. So the only way to physically slow traffic there is to put in some form of raised threshold or other treatment. So what that does is it's counterintuitive to what the function of that road, which is as an access road. So it would start to impinge on, larger vehicles, buses, that sort of thing. So, there are other options. They will be more expensive and they will have more negative impacts on other road users. So it's always a trade-off. But in terms of, safety outcomes, we're looking at the full range of users. So yes, the most vulnerable users are clearly the ones that we should consider, in all cases. But we consider those vulnerable users in all, pedestrian applications. So.
Okay, so what we heard earlier today was that the community there, and particularly the school community that was represented, thinks that the current situation is clearly inadequate when it comes to the safety of students coming to and from school. And I know you've outlined some options around what could be done around signage and those sorts of things, but I guess signage doesn't feel like it's actually going to slow traffic down. If we look at the fact we've got a lot of signage around the city and we have speed issues in lots of other places, so are there other ways that we could get the response that the community want, making it safer, through, I guess the notice of motion here is for something very specific, the zebra crossing. I'm aware that there is an alternative recommendation around what other options there are, but are we looking at big changes required to look at other options, or are there still further works that could be done with the current setup? I guess I'm not an engineer, but build-outs and all various other things that don't exist currently
in terms of a simple solution that to increase the visibility of the crossing, we'd be looking at road markings, something like the red pavements that we've done on Roberts Line, on approach to Railway Road. So it highlights that there's something ahead that cautions drivers to slow down, and then hopefully recognise that there's children waiting or on approach to the crossing. That would probably be the simplest and most cost-effective solution that we could implement. But otherwise, yes, if you're going to try and reduce speed, you'll be looking more along the lines of build-outs or platforms. A zebra crossing would be a low-cost solution. It's just that it does create, it can create some confusion in terms of priority, just based on the road rules and particular behaviours. Because with zebra crossings, pedestrians can't just run out onto the road, and drivers don't actually need to slow down for a zebra crossing if there's no one waiting at them. So there's still particular issues with the laws and how they work.
Are we in a situation that, in regards to your idea of the paint on the road, for lack of a better technical explanation, that we could actually go ahead and do something like that and trial it and see if that makes a difference, for the remainder of the year? Are we in a position that we can actually respond reasonably quickly, or is that?
Yeah, we've met with the school and we've said we'd offer that up, so that's not an extremely expensive solution, so we could do that. I mean, in terms of other solutions, we could put in signalised crossing. Okay, we could put in a whole traffic calming, but we would have to calm that whole region. All right, so yes, there are other options which could, but they will have other impacts. So. And we did make the suggestion, we hadn't discussed with the school, but I heard the principal say that he didn't feel it was practical. We could modify the current crossing to be a Kia crossing. So the signs don't need to be carried; they could simply be locked away at the crossing, but that requires a commitment in terms of staff and students and things. So, you know, there are some options, but, you know, I think the other thing is what's there unsafe? I think we would say the evidence is there's already quite a lot of compliance and quite a lot of improvement. Maybe it's just about the expectation is that a different treatment would be safer. We would suggest no, that one that's being nominated would not be safer. It actually would be less safe. So, but there are other alternatives that could potentially deliver better outcomes, but they will have other, they will result in other compromises. So, and there's a budgetary issue as well. So obviously, you know, if we do something else, it's more money that we can't spend somewhere else, and you'll be aware that we have any number of locations across the city where we have concerns around speed and around pedestrian safety. So, you know, we believe this is an appropriate solution for this location. Some enhancements are possible, but yeah, it's not the ultimate. It's not the ultimate. Yeah, we could spend more money on a more elaborate solution, but it will have effects. So yeah.
Happy with that. Councillor Johnson.
My questions, I think, have been answered, really. They were around what other options would make the crossing safer, so I think it's probably been covered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll jump in with a question that I have is, what, if that's the position now, what was the proposal to have 3 crossings? And I understand a zebra crossing was part of the original proposal with the school that they mentioned this morning, with 2 other officers admittedly, but...
yeah, there were 3 crossings, specifically one either side of the railway crossing and one which was responding to the, you know, the desire to have something quite close to the end of the pathway. So there was, officers had never made a commitment to put a zebra crossing in, but the principal had indicated that that was a solution that they felt, or their community felt would be, you know, from their understanding, a safer option. So it was never proposed that we would build a zebra crossing. We said we would go away and consider it. It was part of the concept discussions. What we came back with was pedestrian crossing points. So we have not installed any new pedestrian crossings in the city. In fact, we have been removing them steadily because of their suboptimal safety outcomes here.
In terms of the 3 islands, so the original plan was for one either side of the railway and then one to the north to the nearest intersection. Because of the new intersection with the council subdivision, we were instructed that that one was going to conflict with the intersection, so we had to move that slightly out, which came closer to the other one, so it made sense just to remove the other one as it wouldn't provide that much of a benefit.
Okay, thank you. Continuing with others, Councillor Naylor, then Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you. Just in terms of the, I mean, we heard from the principal that they haven't felt that it was realistic to actually man a crossing. But if they were to make a decision to resource manning the crossing, could they do that with the current format, or would there need to be further modifications?
No, we could use the basic pedestrian crossing point. We have to put in some poles either side, which lock up the you know, the swing arms, as it were. So, okay. So you'd probably, I mean, I don't understand, but probably they have to coordinate when the children were crossing the whole road, so they would cross through the island and into the other side. So.
Okay, yeah. And just in terms of the report 2.3 to 2.4, where it talks about the quantity of vehicles per day and the fact that that's going to increase with the new subdivision. At what point is a controlled crossing, you know, a...
light controlled or
yeah,
traffic
the lights,
signals?
at what point is that indicated in terms of, is that to do with quantity, yeah, justified or...
Yeah, it's probably, generally they recommend pedestrian operated signals at probably at high volumes of pedestrians, something along the lines of 50 to 100 pedestrians per hour.
Sorry to interrupt, Chris. I really can't hear over in this corner. Could you speak up?
It's a combination both of vehicle volumes, but also really the pattern and density of pedestrian movement. So generally, we've put them in where there are really large numbers, 50 to 100 pedestrian movements over very extended periods. I mean, they've gone in, for instance, we put one at the hospital. I mean, clearly there's, steady movements of pedestrians there all day. They've gone in, the NZTA made the call to put it outside Queen Elizabeth College, largely because you've got, 4-lane road there, which is very problematic to cross. And we've got, again, on Fitzherbert outside Girls High. So, there are other locations which might justify that, and certainly we'd consider it over time, but this is probably not going to meet that threshold at all, no.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this report. Looking at this report, one of the options that you've said, which is a practical solution with improved safety outcomes, is a raised platform with pedestrian zebra crossing. And so just looking at the risks around that, if you put in a raised pedestrian crossing in that space, would that have the negative safety outcomes listed in the risks?
No, it doesn't. But what it does is it slows the speed environment. So now we've got large vehicles and buses crossing over. So we have to design them. We'd have to put them in multiple locations so that we slow vehicles. It's a bit like what's happening around the square, where we're looking to slow traffic movement so that when vehicles are coming to those pedestrian locations, they're already moving at slow speed. So they're anticipating going over a big bump. So, they're slowing down regardless of whether there are pedestrians there. So that means that if a pedestrian steps out onto that, even if they haven't looked, there's a very short stopping distance. So you get much better safety outcomes. So we don't believe that that's an optimal treatment for this corridor, because it's a collector road that carries lots of traffic. It's key within the network. So that's a compromise we don't. But you can always make that compromise anywhere. So, yeah, that's always an option.
Okay. Well, right. So that's something to think about. Just keeping with that a little bit. If we had the raised platform with the pedestrian crossing, would that result in the loss of NZTA funding support, which is the second risk?
Well, not necessarily, but what we have to balance, and what NZTA is looking for us to do, is to have a holistic, strategy across how we implement and spend our dollars. We do not have unlimited amounts of money. NZTA will limit the amount of money they will invest in this particular area of minor safety. So they will be looking to see that we're putting appropriate investments and appropriate treatments which are justified by the location and by the nature of the network. So we have a thing called a network operating plan, which sets priorities for different roads and different modes. So, probably not in the short term, but if we continue to do, these ad hoc types of changes to treatment which don't align with wider guidance and wider strategy, I think that will put at risk, their continuing support. So,
Okay.
it's a matter of incremental trust, really. So we have a high level of trust at the moment that we're, as officers, providing robust and appropriate levels of intervention, which are value for money. They're always looking to see that, money's spent appropriately. And I think if we depart from that, over time, there is a risk in terms of the, level of support. So.
And so is the raised pedestrian crossing more expensive or less expensive than the other measures you were talking about in terms of lights?
Well, traffic signals are the most expensive. Then a series of traffic calming and raised platforms will be next in terms of cost, and then we're down to pretty much the treatment you've got now, which is one of the lower cost. It's not. I mean, we're talking 60,000, I think, was it?
60 for the pair.
Yeah, 64 for the two.
So 64,000 for
$60,000 for the two treatments either side of the railway crossing. So.
Two treatments, right? And so in your opinion, I mean, you've already said that just the straight pedestrian crossing is not the safest option. But if we had all the money in the world, what would be the safest option in this corner?
Well, basically the issue in our network for pedestrians is speed, all right? So ultimately, the safest is to slow down all of these parts of the network, and that means, but it's not just one raised threshold, it's a whole series, and curb extensions, and a whole range of what we call local area traffic management. So it's about slowing vehicles over extended, regions and areas, and that's the sort of treatment that, you will see in other communities where people are looking to slow down the traffic within the neighbourhood. We see a whole, see raised intersections and raised thresholds and traffic calming devices. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, the slower the vehicles, the more opportunity for stopping, the less, the less consequences associated with any conflict. And it's not just for pedestrians, but for all other users. So, active transport users as well. So.
Okay, cool, thank you. That's been very helpful.
Thank you, Councillor Hancock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, just a couple of questions really, is that, and just really sort of to get some clarification, is there are two pedestrian refuges, one north, one south of the railway line, and there's probably only about 50 metres between the two of them. Can you provide us some rationale as to why we took that approach rather than just having one crossing point?
It was just basically to cater for any students coming out of the shared path going north or south of the shared path. So if someone was going across a rail line, they didn't have to double back, essentially. It was just to provide convenient crossing or shorter walking distances, essentially.
Yeah, okay. All right, and my observations of both of those crossing points is that the signage is actually different for both. Coming south, there's actually the motif of the children crossing, but going north, that doesn't exist. All there is just the train sign.
Okay, well, that's not by design. I mean, we can certainly fix that. There is signage associated with the rail crossing, so that's obligated, so we should have that on both sides. But in terms of the crossing, maybe there's one sign missing. I mean, we'll certainly address that if that's not present. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Petrinas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for the report. Just following on from Councillor Hancock's quest to understand why the location of the North Pedestrian Refuge is where it is and the South one, can you just confirm why they were placed in those positions?
Well, essentially, we've put two either side of the rail crossing, essentially because we're looking to encourage people to move parallel along James's line to an appropriate place to cross before they move maybe down the walkway. There are side roads in both locations, on both the south and north side, so that also responds to the fact that people may be parking or walking from those particular areas. The northerly site was moved, as Chris has indicated, following an assessment around the conflict with a yet-to-be-built connecting road, which would service the upper terrace. So there was originally going to be one almost trying to respond to the end of the walkway. That had to be moved, so it got so close to the third position that really there was no point, considered to be no efficient point to retain a third crossing. So in effect, there's always some judgment about where appropriately they might be located. But what we didn't want to happen is if students came out of the walkway, they turned down the hill, oh, okay, they've crossed the railway line, okay, they've got to get across the road there potentially to Rosalie Terrace or whatever. So then there was an opportunity there, we put a crossing in that particular location.
From my observation yesterday, the southern refuge bay could present a potential problem for motorists in the sense that I saw children in that pedestrian refuge bay, and motorists do ad hoc stopping to let the children go across. Now, if a car is stopped there, if there's a second or third car, the third car is more than likely stuck on the railway line while that occurs. So how is that matter going to be addressed?
Well, I mean, stacking across railway crossings is always a risk. So, I mean, they're essentially, they're already cross-hatched. I mean, the judgment is you don't enter, you know, the rail crossing if you can't exit. So, you know, I suppose difficult, but yeah, I mean, that is one of the risks, I suppose.
I was a bit surprised about the northern pedestrian refuge bay, because the report that the council addressed at the council meeting, the last council meeting, had a drawing there that showed the actual exit from Tamakuku Terrace subdivision, and it appears to be going right through your northern refuge bay.
Is that a question?
Is it, well, just confirming, does it?
No, I think originally it did, but then we got it relocated, shifted away from it. So I'm not too sure what plans you were looking at, but they might have been, it would have been updated to, so that the new intersection wouldn't be affected.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Just be sure there's no further questions. Thank you, officers, appreciate that. So there's a motion in the name of Councillor Rutherford, which has been moved and seconded. There is also indication of a notice, a motion to the notice of motion. I'm going to, floor is yours to put your...
Are you happy to make, just...
and then we'll debate both.
Okay, so just to I'll give you a preview of the alternative notice of motion should the original one fail. It's that that the Chief Executive consults with Whakaronga School and reports back on options to further improve safety of the pedestrian crossing on James Line. And do you want me to talk about the reasons for?
Yep, that's moved by yourself and seconded by Councillor Bowen. Yes.
You want me to talk to it now? So the reason for proposing this is that, you know, I've got considerable sympathy for the community and for the intent of the original notice of motion. And listening to the principal this morning, I understand that there are continuing concerns about safety of that pedestrian crossing. And I know it's a fast road, and I know that, you know, small, younger children don't always have good judgment about speed of cars. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, you know, I accept the expertise of the officers around the perceived safety of a zebra crossing being higher than the actual safety of a zebra crossing. And it seemed to me, and I think this came out in questioning, that the principal and others had presumed that a zebra crossing would be a safer treatment, and that's why they were advocating for it. So I think there's a third way here, which is, you know, not to do nothing, because this clearly is considerable concern, but also not to do a zebra crossing as a sort of reflex kind of, we want to do something to make this safer and we think this would work, when we know that actually pedestrian crossings are less safe. So I think we do need to listen to community concerns about safety. I think in this instance we just need to put cost to one side for the time being, because, you know, naturally people will say, well, what's the cost of a life? And so what I would like to see is more consultation with the school and report back to council on options with costs to further improve the safety of the pedestrian crossing on James Line. And a number of options have been traversed today, from a signalised crossing to paint on the road, a Kia crossing, everything in between. There may be other options as well. But, you know, it is, at times of the day, it's a very highly used crossing by primary school children on a fast road. And I certainly think that there's an argument for more being done. So it's an attempt to give effect to the intent of the notice of motion, rather than just agreeing with a treatment which I understand would not be any safer and in fact would probably be a lot worse.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor, did you want to speak on behalf of Councillor Hapeta in response to the notice of motion?
Sure. Just a couple of brief comments. You know, try to represent the views of Councillor Hapeta as much as I can. And I have a great deal of sympathy for her in this situation, because she's put forward this notice of motion in response to hearing the concerns of the community on a fairly regular basis since we did the upgrade of James Line and we put in the pathway through to Whakaranga School. And in addition to that, she's also heard quite strong concerns from the school, and her view was that actually we weren't listening as an organisation. And obviously we have actually, there's been meetings with the school and there's been communication and you know, I don't think it's about placing blame anywhere, but I think that what I've heard is that certainly the people who hold concerns around safety don't feel that they have been heard. And so the notice of motion came about because doing nothing was not an option. We had to do something. And much like when we heard the concerns of the community in western suburbs around the Monrad Street intersection, you know, we heard advice that the roundabout wasn't the best option, but that was a political decision, and in that instance it was a safer option. So, like I said, I have a great deal of sympathy for this situation that actually Councillor Hapara is trying to improve safety of a space which is highly frequented by young children. So the intent really is to see something happen and to improve the safety. This was one mechanism because this was probably a fairly obvious solution for lots of people at face value, and we have heard quite detailed explanations from staff as to why actually the perception of this is not the reality. So I was really pleased to hear that there are options that we can look at, especially the paint on the road being one, and I would like to think that actually that is something that we would go out and do fairly quickly, albeit it could be a trial to see if it makes a difference, but actually I would like the community to see something happening in that space. But I also support the alternative notice of motion, however we're going to word that, because I think actually the intent is the same. What we're collectively trying to do is increase safety in this space and ensure that actually the community feel like they've been heard, but also they see the council responding to their concerns, which I think is really important. So I'm supporting everything so far.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Just for a point of process that we will be opening up, I'm not closing comment, but just so you know where the process will be, is that we'll be putting this recommendation first, because then if it fails, we'll take the indication of the alternate notice of motion accordingly. So that will be the process. I've got speakers in line, Councillor Hancock, Councillor Meehan, and take indications for others.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't be supporting this for the following reasons. Firstly, just putting some paint on the road is not going to make this any safer for children to cross. My preference would be to go and support the alternate resolution. And can I perhaps comment on that now?
Yes, please.
And the reason for that is that the current setup actually lacks visibility, particularly going from south to north. The two crossings within 50 metres, I think, also adds to the confusion of what that particular area actually looks like as being approached by motorists. And the two crossings within 50 metres of each other, I think, just poses some additional risks for pedestrians. And the other thing too is we've got a definite inconsistency in terms of the signage for both crossings. So those are my reasons for not supporting the original motion.
Thank you. Councillor Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't support the notice of motion, and the reasons being is that I've been involved several times in near misses with pedestrian crossings. Because the principal made it very clear we're talking about young children, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, who, and it's not just them, we have adults do it regularly as well, step up to a pedestrian crossing and just stroll on out because they think they've got the right of way. And as we've heard from the officers, the law doesn't state that. They have to wait till they've clear eye contact, the vehicle stopped, and they can cross the road. I think we send a wrong message to children by putting crossings, putting some paint on the road. I think it needs more work done on it. I think the second motion has put that in the hands that we will do more about it. We need to seriously look at it. I'm a bit taken back by the principal's response this morning that it's a 15-minute walk to go down to have somebody stand there with a high vest. Then we see it around other schools with the same systems in place. One teacher, one parent with a high vest on, guiding children across the road. I find that pretty, I'll hold that to myself, that the school itself doesn't place that in place. I believe if they did a roster with parents and school teachers, they could get people down there every day, and you only need one, down there to monitor the crossing of that road. That's the only way that kids are going to be safe crossing a road. They make wrong judgments. They will continue to make wrong judgments. Adults make wrong judgments. So we can't expect 5 and 6 year olds to make the right judgment when it's coming crossing a road. So we need to investigate this a little bit more, I feel, do a little bit more work on it, but we need to make it a priority to do that work. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be voting against the notice of motion and in favour of the alternative motion. I think we will take some learning away from the conversation today. First thing, maybe being careful in how we discuss issues with our community and how we confirm the outcomes of that discussion so that people are clear about what is going to happen and what isn't going to happen. We might have saved ourselves a lot of trouble if the school had been aware of what was actually planned for that road. My reason for voting against the notice of motion is primarily around the subject which has been well canvassed today, the unintended consequences of that kind of intervention. And the officers' reports were really clear that doing something that seems safe isn't always the safest option. And when we received this notice of motion, I had a quick Google around, as we do, about what is a safe crossing. And the research seems pretty clear, even to a layperson, that the safest crossing is a supervised crossing. And after that, you're really dealing in the margins of safety. So I'm sure that we can do some things with the kind of infrastructure interventions that the officers have talked about, and I would like to see that discussed with the school. But I'd also like to see the school come into that discussion with how they can support the safe travel of those very young children to school if, as the principal indicated, a large proportion of those are unsupervised. That does cause me some concern that we don't overstep into what isn't actually council's responsibility, that we don't pretend that we're making a journey safe that actually isn't safe and needs to be properly supervised, whether that's by the school or the wider community in some way. So, yeah, I'll be supporting the additional notice, the alternative notice, and looking forward to seeing that conversation with the school and community continued at pace. Thank you.
The Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I was going to support this notice of motion because of the reasons the Deputy Mayor spoke about. Was Councillor Harper had received so many inquiries about this from not only the school but parents, and it just seemed that safety was being neglected. But I'm now going to vote against this and support the notice of motion, the alternative notice of motion, because it actually opens it up a bit wider. I think we heard yesterday about safety, didn't we? And it was quite sobering listening to those young doctors. And actually, the officers followed some NZTA advice on and it was wrong. So I'm not totally convinced everything in this report is 100%, and that's no reflection on the advice, because there is no real science. It is research-led, and everything is bespoke at different sets of intersections or pieces of road. So it's about safety, and this is about safety of younger children. I think Councillor Bowen's right. There is a responsibility of the school too. They are one of our fastest growing schools. They were a rural school. They're now sort of on the edge of the city. So maybe there is more of a responsibility with them as well. But let's do that together rather than at loggerheads. And I do think some of the advice here is around adult populations. We're dealing with some children. I'm not sure what the right thing is. I'm not a roading engineer. So let's see what comes back. But what is currently there, I don't think is working. Just on another couple of comments that Councillor Hancock made, I think we're seeing what is there at the moment is probably a work in progress. We've still got the subdivision to go in and the entranceway to that. So I sort of can understand why the officers have put two sets there. Otherwise you would have a very conflicted corridor with a railway line crossing and an entrance to another 120 odd houses. So it's only going to get a bit busier there. But I do think the alternative notice of motion is smart in the sense that let's see what other options are and make a right choice in conjunction with the school. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker, Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I think most things have been said, and I'll be not supporting the notice of motion, but will support the alternate. I think when it comes to safety, we do need to look at evidence and follow the advice of experts, and that's not always just what we think is safest or what the principal or the parents might think is safest. So it is important that we get this right. I'm also very happy that to hear that a manned crossing can be fairly easily accommodated if the school chooses to proceed with that, and certainly 200 to 250 children a day, I think it would be time and effort well invested if they do choose to go down that track.
Okay, thank you. That concludes the debate. We are going to put the recommendation on the screen. Yes, this one here. If this fails, then the alternate notice of motion gets put if you're in favour of that. That is lost 1 vote for, 10 votes against and 1 abstention. This is the alternate notice of motion in Councillor Johnson's name and Councillor Bowen. I'll call for a vote on this. That has passed 11 votes for and 1 abstention. That concludes that item. It now brings us to the work schedule. Item 9. Oh, the only thing we'll just need to take on there potentially, sorry. Just the only thing I wanted to maybe move is that the officers' report be received. Just recommendation 1 of the officers' report. Happy to second it, Deputy Mayor. So this is just recommendation 1. Oh, we can, and 2? Happy to take, yeah, 1 and 2. You happy, Deputy Mayor, 1 and 2? Just for the record.
So, sorry, Mr.
Yes.
Chair.
Sorry, yeah, no, that's just 1, right? Just to receive the report.
We'll take them separately.
Yeah, no, we'll just take number 1, unless somebody else wants to move the recommendation 2. Okay, so we're moving 1 and 2. So that's myself as chair and the Deputy Mayor. This is only for recommendation 1 to receive the report. Okay. Clear on that? Okay, call for a vote. Thank you. That's passed 11 votes for and 1 abstention. That concludes item 8. Now, the work schedule. Is there any further updates? GM? Any questions from members? Queries? Councillor Naylor.
Earlier in the meeting, you mentioned a report coming in December on the Summerhill cycle changes, and I'm just wondering if that's included in on the list, or whether we need to add that.
We can add it. I've just only been updated yesterday that was coming to the December meeting. GM?
That's an officer generated report. It doesn't need to be added to the schedule. will be coming.
Thank you for the query. Any other comments? There being none, I'd invite you to vote to receive, let's move it. I'll move it, seconded Deputy Mayor, and invite you to vote. That's passed, 12 votes for, none against. That concludes our business. I'll close the meeting and pass to you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we'll go into the Missoula room now. Thank you.